Well, hello everybody. Happy to be here. I want to thank Adam for setting this up and World War II Museum for hosting this thing. I see a lot of familiar faces out there. Thank you all for coming. Before I start this, I just want to ask, other than the obvious answer, are there any former or current National Guardsmen in the audience? A few. Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. Now, when I'm doing something internally with the Guard, I don't have to do this part, but I find with the public, it's best to kind of give an idea of exactly what the National Guard is and how it fits into the larger military scene. Not everybody is fully aware of that. So, essentially, the National Guard is the modernized state militia. It's in the olden days, you had community-based units that answered to the state governor. And they were called up by the governor, or they could be called up by the president for larger conflicts like the Civil War, Mexican War, War of 1812, things like that. But by the time the 20th century rolled around, the entire military was being modernized, including the militia. And that's when it sort of officially became the National Guard. And the modernization of the National Guard was basically that it had two mission sets, two statuses, and that's a federal mission and a state mission. Federal mission has generally always been overseas combat operations, and the state mission is mostly seen, certainly in Louisiana, as flood control, flood response, emergency response of different sorts. So that's basically it. For state missions, the governor's commander-in-chief. For federal missions, the president's commander-in-chief, and the Guard units fit into the U.S. Army, or nowadays the Air Force. So that's the state-based component of the U.S. military. Now, going into our story, do a little bit of backstory. World War I was the first real test of this new modernized National Guard. And in a lot of ways, the mobilization for World War I was very successful. In some ways, there were a lot of lessons learned. Maybe we should have done things a little differently. So with the National Guard, what the U.S. Army did in a lot of cases during World War I was they just kind of took individual soldiers out of their units and just kind of plucked them out and stuck them wherever they felt they needed replacements. And there were a lot of people in the Guard who didn't feel that was right, because sort of the basis of the National Guard is unit-based, and these guys train together as a unit. They're supposed to fight together as a unit, at least theoretically. So that wasn't well received. And there were a lot of, within the upper brass of the military, through the interwar years, you had a lot of Guard advocates or people who saw the Guard positively in the military, and you also had congressional pressure to make sure that didn't happen again if another major war were to occur. So World War II, these units do, the Louisiana Guard doesn't fight together as a singular unit, but at the battalion level, these guys generally stay together as a unit fighting under higher command. So what some people would consider the mistakes of World War I in that sense did not reoccur. Also, good to keep in mind in the interwar years, by today's standards, the U.S. Army was tiny. It was about the size of the Army of Romania, about the 17th largest army in the world. The National Guard, although it was much smaller than it is today, didn't do so bad, because during the Depression, a lot of guys needed a little extra money, so you get the drill pay and stuff like that. So National Guard remained alive during the interwar years. In Louisiana, the organization was about less than half the size of what it is now, and the three sort of core units, there were other units too, but the three sort of core units that the Guard was built around leading up into World War II was the Washington Artillery, technically the 141st Field Artillery, Louisiana's oldest continuous unit. Also, you had the 156th Infantry. At the time, they had units all over the state, in every part of the state. That's a little bit different from what they are now, but at the time, they were all over. And the 108th Cavalry. Now, by the late 1930s, cavalry was, sort of the old way of doing things. So they had kind of modernized, and by the end of, by 1940, The 108th Cavalry had most of the cavalry had turned into an anti-aircraft unit called the 105th Coastal Artillery. So those are sort of the main components. And during this time, there's a lot of modernization and updated training and so forth going on. Now, right before the war, we sort of had this narrative that the United States was completely and totally unawares before Pearl Harbor. But the president and a lot of people in the military had a good idea that they didn't know when or how, but at some point the U.S. was going to be in this war. So Roosevelt was sort of slowly mobilizing before the U.S. actually entered the war. One of those things that fits into that is in the summer of 1940, he federalized the National Guard. Now, a lot of people in the country were very opposed to intervention. So his justification for this was, look, there's a big war going on all around us. If we were attacked, these are the home guard guys. So let's just have no training ready. So National Guard nationwide was activated and sent to camps all throughout the country in 1940. One of the places they were sent was central Louisiana. It wasn't just Louisiana guys going there. It was from everywhere in the nation. Central Louisiana had what's generally referred to as the Louisiana Maneuvers. And they actually started in 1940 before U.S. entered the war. And they continued throughout the war. It was basically the entire center part of the state, central Louisiana and North Louisiana, were basically just a giant training ground for soldiers during this time. So it's an important piece of Louisiana military history. I'm not going to go too much into that because there's a whole other lecture later on this year solely on that topic. But it's good to know. As far as the Louisiana Guard, it fit into the 31st Infantry Division, also known as the Dixie Division, because it was made up of Deep South states, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Florida. Now, this is more a technicality than anything because all but one Louisiana Guard unit served separately from the 31st. There's only one that actually deployed overseas with the 31st Infantry Division. So that's who they were with at the start of the war. Going to state headquarters. State headquarters for the Louisiana National Guard had been Jackson Barracks here in New Orleans in the 9th Ward since the 1920s. Before that, it was a federal facility. So the only component of the Louisiana Guard that was still under the control of the state was a small state headquarters cell. And it was commanded by the Adjutant General, the commander of the Guard, a gentleman by the name of Raymond Fleming. He is, to date, still one of, if not the most influential Guard commander in its history. He was there for a long time. General Fleming, as early as 1936, General Fleming was pushing the need for what became selective service. He was concerned that, in World War I, selective service or the draft was done sort of very last minute. It was kind of done, it was effective and it worked, but he foresaw that if such emergency happened, we needed to have something in place to get mobilization going fast. So he had been pushing he called it emergency manpower procurement, but it eventually became selective service. And in 1940, again, before the war started, Congress and the President did pass legislation that created selective service in the draft prior to Pearl Harbor. As far as Jackson Barracks, you have an empty facility, right? I mean, the Guards all over the country in different places training. You have one little cell operating actually out of that building, which is now called Fleming Hall. And so what the U.S. Army does is they take over Jackson Barracks, expand it, and it becomes the support facility for the port of embarkation, which is, that was on, if you're familiar with New Orleans, you may remember it as Poland Street. It was a military facility for a long time until very recently. And that was the port of embarkation. And so there wasn't any hardcore military training happening at Jackson Barracks. There might have been some specialized training. But really, it was like the last stop shop before you shipped out overseas. So there was a lot of morale building type stuff. USO activities, dances, sporting events, both to view and to take part in, things like that. And yeah, the selective service actually under Fleming actually operated out of that one building, and the rest was controlled by the federal government during that time period. Okay. Now going into the units, Louisiana units. I'm going to start off in the Pacific. Only a small handful of Louisiana Guard units actually went into Pacific theater. Most of them were in North Africa and Europe. So I'm going to start off with these guys. The largest unit that served in the Pacific was the 204th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Group, originally the 204th Coastal Artillery. They actually started out in Shreveport, and they were sent up to California. They were actually in San Diego. So they were they didn't see any action, thankfully, because there was no major Japanese attack on the coastline. But they were serving on the coast of California. They had several units that served underneath them as well. There are also 2 batteries of the 105th. If you remember, I said the 108th Cavalry sort of reorganized into the 105th Anti-Aircraft Artillery, originally called the Coastal Artillery. And those 2 units ended up in Pacific Islands, Christmas Island, and Solomon Islands. And they were eventually sort of organized into the regular army. Just as something that'll come back again later, one of the executive officers for one of those batteries was actually a gentleman by the name of Raymond Huff, who we'll come back to later. So just mentioning that now. Now, I mentioned there was one unit that stayed with the 31st Infantry Division throughout the war, and that's the 106 Medical Battalion. They were one of the main medical units for the 31st Division. They mostly saw action in New Guinea and the liberation of the Philippines. Started off slow and geared up. They were the only hospital for the Morotai landings over that time period. It was pretty intense. And then, of course, the liberation of the Philippines was a major event as well. They were, and it talks about how active they were. There was a 24/7 operation. They were the main medical unit in that area for the 31st Division for the Philippines liberation. All right. Oh, I will mention briefly, there was a unit that served in both theaters. Started out as the 106th Quartermaster Regiment, was also with the 31st Division. It was disbanded. It was made up of units from all the different states that were in the 31st. But it disbanded, and out of that, the 133rd Quartermaster Truck Company was created. And that was just Louisiana guys. That was initially in Alaska. Not sure what they were doing there, but they were in Alaska for the early part of the war. And they supported the Normandy campaign in Europe. They weren't in that first group of landings, but they came in as transportation, maintenance, that sort of thing, to support the Normandy landings afterward. Now, moving into North Africa, we're going to talk about the 122nd Observation Squadron. 122nd is actually the sort of founding unit of the Louisiana Air National Guard. The Air National Guard didn't exist yet. At this point, they were part of the Army Guard. These were New Orleans guys. They started out in New Orleans. Their base of operations initially was the Lakefront Airport. And then when they were federalized, they moved up to Camp Beauregard, Nestler Field. So they moved up took part in the maneuvers up there. And then Pearl Harbor happened, and they were brought back down to New Orleans. And initially, they were anti-submarine patrols over the Gulf of Mexico and the waterways around New Orleans as well. Now, at that point in time, they were flying old, some sort of rickety planes almost, O-47s, O-38s, these sort of just observation planes with no munitions, no bombs, no guns or anything. So what their mission was if they saw a submarine, they were supposed to report that they saw it, where it was, and then try and keep eyes on it until a bomber from Keesler would come out and meet them. So I'm not sure how many subs were actually, seen, but it wasn't too much activity at this point in time, early in the war. when they went into training in several different places across the country. And although they remained an observation squadron, they also trained as bombers and fighters in different planes too. So they had different skill sets going into North Africa. They took part in Operation Torch, which was the initial landings in North Africa. They were one of the first guard units to take part in that operation. They were split into the air echelon and the ground echelon for these landings. The air echelon would have been the pilots and the planes and the immediate maintainers, the maintenance guys for the planes and the mechanics. And the ground echelon would have been all the other support, engineers, supply, different, whatever else. And the ground echelon was actually used as infantry for the landings, and they apparently did quite well, even though they were air support personnel. They supported the landing at Oran, Algeria, and also at Fidela. I'm guessing that's how you pronounce it. One little piece of the group that landed at Fidela I found kind of interesting. They had submarines taking out landing craft as they were coming in, landing there, and these guys, it was like 4 or 5 guys from the 122nd, commandeered a fishing boat and went out and rescued 40, 50 soldiers who otherwise probably would have drowned. So, it's a nice little piece of what they did there. The air echelon landed in Morocco, and they were part of the 68th Observation Group, 12th Air Force. They were again tasked with anti-submarine missions, similar to what they were doing in New Orleans, but that didn't last too long. They switched mission sets because they were trained in different aircraft and different types of activity. They switched mission sets while in North Africa to be a training unit for fighter pilots. So this is P-38s, P-39s, other fighter craft to train with. And they did that. All of these units saw lots of casualties, including a lot of fatalities. But when a commander goes down, it has some significance. Their commander, Captain Sam Zamuri, Jr., who is the same, if you're familiar with New Orleans history, Sam Zamuri Sr. is like one of the fruit company magnates of the United States. So this was his son. He and his crew encountered bad weather over the mountains of North Africa and crashed. So that was one of the fatalities during that mission was their commander, Sam Zamuri. So this unit, with each reorganization, personnel would kind of be placed in different areas and reassigned. So by the time they were reorganized into a bomber squadron, which is what happened right before they went into Europe, almost all of the personnel that started with the 122nd wasn't with them anymore. So they became the 885th Bomber Squadron, and I've been told, I haven't seen the records on it, but I've been told they took part in the D-Day landings just as support. And one thing I know they did was, as a bomber unit, they actually did supply drops to both Allied soldiers and humanitarian drops in southeastern Europe to people who were in just a war-torn area without much to have. So that's what they did. Sticking with North Africa, the 105th, that unit that was reorganized from the 108th Cavalry. You had the 2 units that went to the Pacific, but it was expanded, and most of them went to North Africa and Europe. So they took part in the North Africa landings as well. These guys were anti-aircraft. They were there to shoot down German planes. They had 40mm Bofor guns and 50 cal machine guns was their main weapons. One person from Louisiana history who took part, who was one of the company commanders actually, was Francis Grevenberg, New Orleans area guy. He later became more famous as the head of the state police. He was sort of like a Elliot Ness type figure, busting gambling operations and things like that in the 50s. And he stayed with the Guards. These pictures actually from the 1950s. And he was one of the commanders, the company commanders in this group. Battery D took part in the Battle of the Kasserine Pass, which was the first major land battle between German and American forces in North Africa. And there was a lot of back and forth, taking over territory. One thing that Battery D did, as this happened, their position was about to be overrun by German units. So first they used their guns land capacity and held off Germans for long enough for a lot of other units to get their equipment and their vehicles out of the area. And then before they left, they didn't have time to take their guns apart and get them out. So what they did is just took certain components out of their guns, out of their artillery, and left them there, but they were completely not functional. So the Germans couldn't use them, and it was really of no value to the Germans when they came in and took over. The next day, the Americans came back and took the position again. The 105th guys put those pieces back in their guns, and they were up and running really fast. For that action, General Patton actually gave them a commendation. They continued on into Sicily as a unit, and ultimately into Italy. They were stayed with the 7th Army, and later on they kind of hooked up with the 935th Field Artillery, who we're going to talk about in just a second as well. Okay, now moving into Italy, we have our Field Artillery units. If you're from around here or familiar with Louisiana military history, you probably know the Washington Artillery. They're still around. In World War I, they became the 141st Field Artillery. They're still called the Washington Artillery, though. And in the build-up to, actually during the war, they were split in half and expanded, and their sister unit was called the 935th Field Artillery. So these two units kind of come together. They were under the 6th Corps, 45th Infantry Division, or the 141st I'm talking about, was under the 45th Infantry Division, and also working with the British 1st Infantry Division. Their main action, and one of the most significant actions that I think that they were involved in, was the Anzio beachhead, the Anzio beachhead. It's a campaign that doesn't get much coverage and a lot of sort of pop coverage anyway. It's not like D-Day or the Battle of the Bulge or something. But from the soldiers' perspective, it was a very intense, long campaign. That was like a meat grinder. Germans, they landed safely enough initially, but then the Germans maintained high ground. It took months for them to break out of that position. So this was like just a grind for these guys. This was a really hard fought campaign. And in the sort of first-person account you see of the 141st in this war, they always talk about Anzio, because that was sort of the most dramatic thing they were involved in. To give you an idea, they talk about how the ammo trucks couldn't get through the terrain because it was, for two reasons. It was so bad, so scarred up from German artillery, and it was just, the weather was bad, the terrain was just bad in general. They had to carry 95-pound shells manually across long distances over open areas, and it was just a rough campaign for these guys. The 935th were at Monte Cassino, not too far away, which was also another very hard fought campaign. One of the interesting things that I noticed looking at the first-hand accounts was that there was a lot of reluctance to bomb the monastery there. It's a religious thing, it's historic, but the Germans were using that to their advantage. So ultimately they decided to disregard and go ahead and shell where they had to. It is mentioned later that American funds were used to restore that monastery after the war. But that was sort of a thing that was difficult for them to come to. But guys were dying, Italy actually saw a confluence of some Louisiana Guard activity. The 935th and 141st were always not too far away from each other. But the 935th were actually supported by the 105th. When they came up into Italy, they provided support against aircraft coming in, while the 935th focused on field artillery. So they worked together at one point. There's in the first-person accounts of the 141st at Anzio, there's a mention. I mentioned Ray Huft earlier. He had switched to a sort of a special operations unit. They noticed he was running around, so you have these Louisiana guys kind of accidentally bumping into each other there. Something that happens in New Orleans, where you know, like go to the grocery store, you always bump into somebody you know. And then they broke through, these campaigns broke through and succeeded about the same time, and they all kind of rushed into Rome. Now, the Germans had left Rome, had abandoned it, so it wasn't a hard-fought battle. But and there's a lot of, from historians and leadership at the time, there was criticism of entering Rome instead of pursuing the Germans. And I'm not going to go into all that, but from the soldiers' perspective, you can definitely see they needed that breather. You know, they got into Rome, and there wasn't activity going on in Rome in terms of enemy attack. So they got a little bit of breather before they went back up into the mix. So and Washington Artillery, the 141st, was the first artillery unit to get into Rome, and our local newspapers like to point that out. So, and one reason you don't hear about Rome, liberation of Rome, so much is because it was a big morale victory. But it happened on June 5th, 1944. So what happened the next day kind of took the press. Okay, so talking about D-Day, talking about June 6th, we have the 156th Infantry Regiment. It's another old unit in Louisiana. These guys were actually, they shipped to England, and the 2nd Battalion, or I guess I should say this, the original 2nd Battalion, actually was separated from them, and so was the band. I'm going to talk about 1st and 3rd Battalions first. 1st and 3rd Battalion were the guys who trained the soldiers for D-Day. They did amphibious landing operations, and they didn't know that they were doing it for D-Day, but they trained other soldiers in tactics for landing ultimately on D-Day. One of the companies, Company L, which is from West Louisiana, sort of Lake Charles area, they actually took part in the landings. And as I mentioned to someone earlier, I'm not sure what higher command they were under. There's not a ton of documentation on it, but they took part in the landings and then went back and joined up with their regiment. I think they were third at the top. After D-Day and after the armies sort of were advancing into Europe, the 156th, 1st and 3rd, the 156th acted as security for the supply lines. Armies were moving fast. There were still packets of German resistance here and there. They sort of acted as security for the supply lines behind the advancing armies. And then they got taken and moved to the Channel Islands. When the Normandy invasion occurred, they just bypassed. There were islands in the English Channel, and they were all manned by they had German units there. But it was just, it would have been taken too long to fool with those, so they just bypassed them completely. But you don't want enemies in the rear, so they sent 1st and 3rd were two of the units that got sent back to clear out those Channel Islands of the Nazi units that were there, and that's how they finished out the war. 2nd Battalion, it gets a little confusing because there's actually 2 2nd Battalions of the 156th during the duration of the war. The first 2nd Battalion, it's confusing, but the original 2nd Battalion, actually because they were Cajun, they came from Cajun country. That's where even today's 2nd Battalion is based in that area. They could speak French, so the Army took them and moved them into Algeria, North Africa, because it's French-speaking area, and they actually acted as MPs and guards for prisons there. And they eventually got reorganized into regular Army MP units. And when that happened, that cleared the Army to create a new 2nd Battalion in Europe. So the new 2nd Battalion, it was made up of some Louisiana guys, but also just other guys from wherever. The XO was actually Leonard Pauly Sr., who became a big guard commander later on after the war. And then that's pretty much it. They were actually the security for the Supreme Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. So Eisenhower, they were Eisenhower's bodyguards, essentially. Now, moving on to the band. The band was also separated. And before you think the band's boring, the band actually did some interesting things. They, this is the 1940s, not too many military bands, know much beyond military music and maybe like some swing standards and things like that in the 1940s. These guys knew a little bit of jazz. They were from Louisiana, and they, so they were good essentially. They were good. They were great at entertaining soldiers, and they were retained in England as a morale booster at U.S. Bases where U.S. soldiers were headquartered in England. They were on all kinds of BBC radio broadcasts. They played live events, mostly for soldiers. That's what their main job was. But they played for VIPs. I believe they actually played at an event that the English king was at. And the most interesting thing for me that they did, they were the entertainment for the Potsdam Conference. So you had these large they called the Big Three conferences with the leaders of Russia, the UK, and the United States. This was the last one. Harry Truman, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill. During the course of that, Winston Churchill was booted as prime minister, and Clement Attlee came in. So I like to believe they played for Churchill, but I'm not sure which one was there when they actually played. But they played at this large event that basically decided the fate of the post-war world. These guys were the entertainment. Last unit I'm going to talk about is the 773rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. It's commanded by a New Orleans guy by the name of Frank Speece. He actually has legacy. His grandson with the same name is an officer in the Guard today. It was carved out of the 141st Field Artillery early in the war. They took personnel from that and combined it with personnel from Pennsylvania. So it's kind of a joint, mostly Louisiana guys, but some Pennsylvania Guardsmen as well. Now, in a lot of World War II sort of scholarship and criticism at the time in the military, there was a consensus that tank destroyer battalions were not that good, that they weren't very successful, weren't worthwhile. Thankfully, there's a little bit of a debate about that now, and I can tell you that the 773rd did not contribute to that opinion. They were considered by people in regular Army and by generals and so forth to be one of the best tank destroyer battalions in the war. They were called M10s. It looks like a tank to the regular eye. It's actually designed to kill tanks and other vehicles, and it's called a tank destroyer. They went into Europe after D-Day. They didn't take part in the landings, but they went in afterwards, mostly with the 90th Infantry Division. One of the first things they did was with the Argentan-Falaise campaign in France. It was 4 days. With 4 days of fighting, they took out over 40 tanks, 82 vehicles, and artillery on top of that. And they took out. They were very helpful, more than tank destroyer battalions were expected to be, and they got the Presidential Unit Citation for that one. They continued that work, moving through Europe, through the Siegfried Line, across the Rhine into Germany. One of the more interesting things about them is they're one of the very few U.S. units that actually went all the way to Czechoslovakia. Most didn't go that far, that deep. They actually were in Czechoslovakia only for a few days because at the top brass did not want U.S. soldiers getting into conflict with Russian soldiers, with Soviet soldiers. So they returned back and went back into Germany. Another thing that's interesting about Company A took part in something kind of interesting from pop culture, I guess, perspective. I'm guessing most people here have at least heard of, if not seen or read, The Monuments Men. That's the movie about the unit that went in and they were trying to locate and save cultural pieces of art and stuff. Well, in the end of the movie, they find this big mine that's full of art treasures and lots of gold bullion. So it was kind of a big deal, and Company A of the 773rd was actually the unit that guarded, that was provided security for that mine after it was discovered. I feel remiss if I didn't talk on Ray Huft. Most of his activity in the war was not with a Louisiana Guard unit, but he started out with the 105th. Went into the Pacific with one of those batteries that went into the Pacific. He volunteered for what's called the First Special Services Force. First Special Services Force is an interesting unit. It's sort of a predecessor to today's Special Operations or Special Forces units. Initially, it was mountain warfare, but they expanded into just really any terrain. They were like at night go behind enemy lines and cause disruption and break up infrastructure and do sort of not unconventional type warfare. He ended up the most decorated soldier from Louisiana, coming out of World War II. Some of the stories were like something from a movie that you'd see. One thing is an ammo truck was right next to where he and some other units were, and they had artillery and gunfire coming at them, and they were really vulnerable, and he knew his guys might basically blow up if someone hit that ammo truck. So he ran out into the open, took the ammo truck, drove it far enough away that it was no longer a danger. That's one of the things he did. After the First Special Service Force disbanded, he became a battalion commander for the 45th Infantry Division. With that, in Germany, right after crossing the Rhine, they were up against a German unit who was kind of trapped, but they were still fighting back hard. And Huft, he didn't want his guys to die. It was sort of useless for the German guy who was going to have to surrender no matter what. So he sort of parleyed with this German commander and said, hey, look, if you surrender, neither of our guys die, and I'll work on getting you a steak dinner tonight if you do it. And I don't know if the steak dinner ever happened, but it worked. The German commander surrendered. So he was involved with a lot of, he was actually the first officer of the 7th Army to cross the Rhine because he used his First Special Services Force sort of skills the night before all the armies crossed the Rhine River. He and a hand-selected group of guys with him, they crossed in a little raft across the river and went around doing recon and scout work, and then came back across. So after leading his unit across the Rhine into Germany and the whole steak dinner thing, he was injured. He was injured multiple times, but the last one was the doozy. He got shot in the chest. But he did survive and stuck around for a long time. He eventually became the Adjutant General of the Louisiana National Guard in the early Cold War period after the war. And with Fleming, he was one of the two most influential commanders from that time period, so the early mid-20th century. Now, at the beginning, we talked about the dual mission, the federal mission overseas and also the state mission. Well, the entire National Guard, except for that one small state cell, is either training or overseas. So what happens if a hurricane hits? What happens if there's a flood? Well, there was some debate about that. The governor, Sam Jones, was just like, the state police can handle it. But General Fleming, who was adjutant general at the time, he didn't think that was good enough. So he talked the governor into it and pushed in the state legislature to have an interim disaster response unit created, which was the Louisiana State Guard. And they did have a few hurricanes and some floods. Nothing really big though, thankfully, because they weren't that big and they didn't train a whole lot. It was mostly made up of World War I veterans who were still able-bodied, and and whatever young guys didn't go serve overseas. So they had hurricanes and flood covered for the most part. And one of the biggest things that they were involved in, though, wasn't disaster. Well, some people might consider Leander Perez to be a disaster. I don't know. Actually, Leander Perez was the political boss of Plaquemine Parish, He had held several different positions. Easiest just to call him the political boss. Very influential politically in the state, especially in the southern part of the state. He's sort of notorious for later activity in the 50s and 60s for like sort of anti-integration stuff. But he was causing problems for governors long before that. He was so the sheriff of Plaquemine Parish dies while in office. According to state law, the state governor is actually who appoints the interim sheriff. Well, Leander Perez did not agree with that at all. He saw a different reading of the law, and he appointed his own guy. It just so happens that Governor Sam Jones and Leander Perez are not only bitter political enemies, they hate each other passionately. So neither one of them wants to back down on this. Leander Perez kind of creates his own, I guess his deputies, just a bunch of guys with shotguns and rifles. Sam Jones orders General Fleming to activate the state guard and go down there and enforce his rule. So thankfully there was no shots fired. It was mostly just kind of posturing and so forth. But the state guard's biggest activity during the war was actually dealing with Leander Perez. It was called, in the newspapers, it was called the Little War. So even during the biggest wartime, the biggest conflict in human history, Louisiana politics are still Louisiana politics. So that was what they were up to. So one of the things about the Guard is it's so very based on units and communities that they're based in. In all the military units, history and lineage is important. But with the Guard, it's almost especially so because they're connected to these local communities. So we're going to kind of do like a brief "where are they now" type of thing. Under engineers, the 105th Anti-Aircraft Artillery eventually reorganized into what's today's 205th Engineer Battalion, based out of Bogalusa, and they're up in the Florida parishes. In support, the 156th Army Band was eventually separated from the 156th, but they kept the name. They're based out of Shreveport now. They're still around. They're still good. The 773rd Tank Destroyers, they went through a lot of reorganization, but now they have lineage that goes to two units, the 773rd Military Police Battalion and the 165th Combat Service Support Battalion, both of which are based further north of here. In infantry, under today's 256 Infantry Brigade. The 141st Field Artillery Course, Washington Artillery, still there. Probably will be for a long time. Based here out of New Orleans, their headquarters is in Jackson Barracks. The 935th, which was the sister unit of the 141st, stayed alive a little while after the war, but in the 50s was consolidated back into the 141st. The 156th Infantry Regiment, still around. At the time of World War I, they had units everywhere in the state. Now they're really more concentrated in Lake Charles and Cajun country area, sort of central and southwest, so a little bit into central. And the Air Guard, the 122nd Observation Squadron, came back and reformed after the war as the 122nd Bombardment Squadron. And by the end of the 50s, they became the 122nd Fighter Squadron. They're still around. They're part of the 159th Fighter Wing down at Belchase. And they're an interesting unit. During the Cold War, they were important. They did the alerts, sort of flying around to sort of protect the border against possible Soviet incursion, I suppose. And they were stood down in the 90s after the Soviet Union fell, and then 9/11 happened, and now they're back up again flying F-15s with that coastal mission of alert site mission. There's companies all over the state that have lineage that go back to World War II, but they all fall under more recently created battalions and higher commands now. So it would take a long time to research and go into that. One I will mention is the 769th Engineer Battalion in Baton Rouge. They were Company A of the 156th, and now they were expanded after the war, and they have been the sort of traditional unit of Baton Rouge in the same way that the Washington Artillery is the traditional unit of New Orleans. So that's really it. I'm gonna plug our museum real quick. Jackson Barracks had a museum for a long time. Hurricane Katrina came and Jackson Barracks went underwater. The museum was closed. We are open again. We have a brand new building. We are not competition, or you don't like that word, but we're not like this. We're a smaller operation, but we're definitely worth seeing. We cover militia and National Guard history from colonial times all the way up to Iraq and Afghanistan. We're continuing to build and expand our exhibits. Worth checking out. We're on the border of Orleans and St. Bernard Parish. Admission is free. You do have to go through we're an active military base, so you have to go through a gate guard. Just flash your ID, say what you're doing. You go into the museum, and they'll let you in. It's no problem. My name is Rhett Breerwood. There's my contact information. We do have archives and a research library there as well. So if you want to do research, if you're a student doing a thesis paper, we have a lot to offer there. Please come see us. And I guess that's it. So I guess open to questions after that. But thank y'all all for coming.
Who pays the salaries and state funded or?
Oh, that's a doozy of a question. It gets complicated. There's
who pays?
Primarily the bulk of activity money for guard training, anything remotely related to that could be used or related to overseas or federal actions is federal, and it's really the bulk. Even the trucks and stuff you see used during hurricane. Those are things that could be used federally, so most of that's paid for by the feds. There is a decent state component both, but the answer is both, but mostly the feds. I'm paid by the state, but mostly the feds.
I've never heard anything about the 31st Infantry Division. Was that an all-guard division?
Right. It was made up of the guard of each of those states.
And did their unit insignia? I've never even seen that unit insignia before. Did that change, or it's just?
Oh, it's not. It's not around now. They might have like a 31st, infantry brigade or something that might have turned into later on, but it's not around anymore. It was just around for that time.
So the 31st Infantry Division, did the soldiers from Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi come to Louisiana to train?
If they came for the 31st, I believe was at the Louisiana maneuvers, at least part of the time. So yes, the answer is yes. And they trained at different locations throughout the country at different times, but Louisiana was one of the biggest that they participated in. Yep. Anybody else?
All right, great.
All right. The new exhibit, State Goes to War, opens Friday, and with the opening reception next Thursday.